Good morning for the folks who have joined us. We are just waiting for a few more people to join and then we'll get started. But good morning in whatever time zone you're in, and thanks for joining. Well, it's exactly 9 o'clock, Dr. Katz. So I think that we ought to get started with the first of our Wi-Fi at Work series for Wi-Fi Forward. And thank you to the folks who are joining. We're excited about this series. I'm Ellen Satterwhite, Vice President at the Glen Echo Group, and I'm thrilled that you have all joined. This is a new digital event series hosted by Wi-Fi Forward. And as you may know, we, Wi-Fi Forward, are a coalition working to make more spectrum available for shared and unlicensed use. For everything from Wi-Fi to Bluetooth to the uses we make of it in telemedicine and distance learning and just about everything we can think of right now. It seems a little trite to say that Wi-Fi and connectivity are important to us in different ways now than ever before. And more importantly, we've found that people are trying to learn about our networks and how they work, what policymakers can do, what users are doing, both individuals, organizations, but also companies, and how real people can actually benefit from spectrum policy. So we're launching this series to address some of the, what we think are very interesting and emerging topics around Wi-Fi, unlicensed and shared spectrum. So these will be rapid fire field hearings, quick 20 or 30-minute blitzes about key issues. If you have anything you'd like us to address, I'm all ears, because I think crowdsourcing is the name of the game here. But today we are thrilled to welcome Dr. Raul Katz as our first presenter, our guinea pig, to share an economic study he just did on the impact of the latest moves of the FCC to free up spectrum for unlicensed and shared use. Just for some housekeeping before I turn it over to Dr. Katz, for the sake of time, we won't be accepting questions directly through the webinar, but if you have questions for our speaker, please email wififorward@glenechogroup.com, and I will be going through those and asking. And after the webinar, we'll upload this video to YouTube and circulate it via email, so in case you've missed anything. But now I'd like to turn our attention to today's topic and introduce our speaker, Dr. Raul Katz. So I feel as though many folks participating may know him, and we are privileged to have worked with Dr. Katz as Wi-Fi Forward in the past. As an international telecom industry consulting executive, Dr. Katz has provided direction to CEOs and other top management of major telecommunications, software, and information services companies in the area of business strategy, consumer and industrial marketing, and general management approaches. He's currently president of Telecom Advisory Services, a boutique firm that advises clients on the interrelated fields of strategy and regulation. And most recently, as I mentioned, he conducted a study on the potential impact of two then pending proposals to share more spectrum for technologies like Wi-Fi. So Dr. Katz, I think I'll just lay out the two proposals and then turn it over to you, and you'll share with us the findings of your study. So the first proposal under consideration by the FCC is a proposal to add 45 megahertz from the 5.9 gigahertz band to the most widely used Wi-Fi band today. That would, in the very near future, create the country's first super wide Wi-Fi channel. And Dr. Katz will talk about why that's integral to his analysis as he moves forward, I think. The second proposal that was under consideration, but last month was voted unanimously into via order by the FCC, and actually was just published. The final order was published with most of the recommendations, with most of the pieces of the order was published yesterday in the Federal Register, and I think we'll see a little bit of additional movement, I know we will, this summer on other questions to be considered. But this proposal was to share 1200 megahertz of the 6 gigahertz band with Wi-Fi, creating essentially the first greenfield Wi-Fi band that we've ever seen. And I'll end with the punchline, which is that, Dr. Katz, you've estimated that these two moves could add more than 180 billion to the US economy in the next 5 years. So with that, I will turn it over to you and ask you to take us through the findings of your study and how you put it together.
Very good. Thank you, Ellen. Just to start, as you can see on the left-hand side of the chart, the assumption or the context upon which the study is being conducted is that Wi-Fi use is exploding and not actually retrenching. The Cisco's Visual Networking Index is projecting that by 2022, there's traffic conducted on Wi-Fi will reach 51 exabytes. Just for your reference, an exabyte is 1 billion gigabytes. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of how important, how critical Wi-Fi is in the overall context of telecommunications networks in this country and overseas. Along those lines, and you've seen some of these decisions being made and the trends that are occurring, Wi-Fi 6 as the next generation of Wi-Fi is critical insofar that provides an increase in the speed at the router level in aggregate. So you can probably get 9.6 gigabits per second. Obviously that's in aggregate, so that doesn't mean that you're gonna get all that speed at the device level within the household. And obviously this is triggering also a number of use cases, potentially stimulated by the deployment of 5G. We're going to talk about that as well. So in the context of this explosion of Wi-Fi use, the issue is what decisions can the regulators take in terms of allowing more spectrum to be used in an unlicensed fashion in order to leverage these importance that Wi-Fi is assuming in overall communications networks. The study had two purposes as Ellen outlined. One is respond to the specific comments that the FCC in their notice of proposed rulemaking had established, seeking a quantification of the benefits of the 5.9 gigahertz proposal. What is the economic value to be derived out of this? And the second objective was, given that at the time the 6 gigahertz had not reached the decision point within the FCC, there was an interest in estimating the economic value of 6 gigahertz, insofar that both decisions were somewhat interlinked. Along those lines, the overall methodology of the study was to focus in three areas of economic value. The first one on the left is the net impact on the gross domestic product. What is the contribution to the US GDP by accelerating broadband speeds and making more efficient deployment of applications that have an impact on the overall economy? We tend to use the word of spillover, economic spillovers. The second was the producer surplus, and that had two areas in particular. One is what happens if enterprises, by virtue of these new spectrum, can deploy applications in a more efficient way that add value to their functional digitization, whether it's Internet of Things or augmented reality, virtual reality, and the like. So again, it's an issue of spillover that is somewhat differentiated from the GDP impact of the accelerated speed. And the other dimension of producer surplus is what happens if by assigning these amount of spectrum to unlicensed users, we can trigger the development of an ecosystem of companies, both manufacturing devices, developing software, developing applications that create an overall boost to the economy. Obviously, we don't measure that in terms of pure sales, but just the margins of those companies, the profits that those margins of those companies in the ecosystem would be generating. And the third area is the consumer surplus. The consumer surplus, it cannot be added to the GDP impact because it measures the benefit that consumers get out of these faster speeds. And the operating word here is, as labeled in the chart, is the willingness to pay. How much would we be willing to pay for faster broadband speeds within the household? And again, as I said before, these numbers cannot be added to the GDP impact. In addition to that, I must say that we were very careful in trying to prevent double counting in terms of what occurred on the producer surplus and the GDP impact resulting from accelerated speeds. So if you were to piece part this in terms of those three sources of economic value, there you get the components that reach the number that Ellen was referring to, 183 billion to the US economy. It's a cumulative number by 2025. And as you can see, the most important impact is occurring on the GDP rather than in the two other areas. Now, this metric was estimated in the aggregate, so adding up the effects of both proposals. But methodologically, the study had different sort of effects in the sense that we had two proposals and we tried to piece part or split the economic impact of each of those two proposals in terms of the specific value. And we were challenged methodologically at the time that neither of those two had reached the point of decision, which is not the case right now with the 6 gigahertz proposal. We assumed, for purposes of analysis, a sequential approach, that therefore we would measure the impact of the 5.9 gigahertz first and then moving to the 6 gigahertz. This is actually not what has actually happened, but just to explain how we proceeded in our analysis. And in addition to that, there are some areas of impact where the impact of each of those two decisions cannot be split. And that's the third area, where it's the sort of the margins on the sale of Wi-Fi equipment, which is somewhat triggered by the enormous amount of spectrum that is going to be allowed to be used on a licensed fashion. So two decisions sequentially taken, independently measured in terms of value, and some areas where the value was established on an aggregate basis. One of the critical elements of our analysis had to do with the return to speed, what we call the return to speed, i.e., as you see in the left-hand side, what is the economic value of having faster broadband speeds in a given economy? Research on these matters have been occurring ever since the deployment of probably the first generations of wireless, and obviously on wireline. And studies have consistently, with different methodologies and metrics, established that there is a positive link between faster broadband and economic growth. Now, why is that occurring? Well, clearly there's more efficient transfer of information within faster broadband infrastructure. There's also the ability to introduce new applications under faster broadband networks that couldn't be done in prior generations. But definitely the impact had been able to empirically be proven about the relationship between speed and economic growth. So how do we apply that concept to our study at hand? And there are some issues that I need to bring to your attention that are more included in the study itself, but refer to these calculations. We assume that by 2022, 50% of American households will be purchasing a broadband plan that is in excess of 100 megabits per second. Now, you might think that this is too high, except that you've got to see that the FCC even projected in 2018 that 65% of households could purchase a plan in excess of 150 megabits per second. Therefore, what we're saying is that there's going to be a higher migration to faster speeds as the kind of service that we're going to be purchasing from the broadband providers. Now, what this means is that if we forecast these over time, the speed that we're going to get in the household up to the router, that is the wall in the house, is going to be increasing. If we weren't doing anything at the router level, that means within Wi-Fi, the maximum speed that the dual band routers can deliver today is approximately 260 megabits per second. That's the maximum. And that's in the aggregate. So that means that at the device level, we are getting much lower speeds. And this is where the problem comes when we talk about congestion. That in fact, if the FCC weren't doing anything or haven't done anything on the 6 gigahertz band, the Wi-Fi router becomes the bottleneck for the speed in networks. And so if that were to be the case, then we modeled the situation where we say, well, let's assume that these decisions are made in terms of assigning higher spectrum to Wi-Fi, and therefore that the speed at the house could be reflecting the speed that the house is getting by the wireline broadband service providers. If that were to be the case, then the research indicates that for every 100% increase in speeds, we're getting an impact on GDP of 0.73%. Now, obviously, we weren't going to get 100%, but we apportioned that in terms of the increase in speeds that we will be getting by making these Wi-Fi bands available. And that's where we're getting the impact on the GDP. Now, on the other hand, consumers, us, we're going to get more value, which again is not added to the GDP impact that I was mentioning before, and that's what we call the consumer surplus. Now, clearly, the faster speeds we get, we're less willing to pay money. If we were to migrate from 1 megabit per second to 3, we would be so anxious to pay additional money that we would be willing to pay close to $4 to $5 for that jump. But if we were to get to these faster speeds that we're talking about, the value that we would be getting is declining on a marginal basis. So probably in getting the faster speeds, by looking at research that was conducted by several academics, we see that within this context of declining marginal value, households would be willing to pay $1.10 per month for the speeds that would be enabled by making those decisions at the Wi-Fi level. So we have these two effects. Impact on the GDP and consumer surplus driven by the willingness to pay for additional speeds. Now, moving to the next level of impact, enterprises are going to get some savings. And the savings are derived by the fact that enterprises today are quite dependent on Wi-Fi to deliver traffic within larger complexes, but also in terms of new applications. In fact, Cisco's Visual Networking Index had to update their forecast in terms of the offloading of Wi-Fi between 2019 and 2020, reflecting the fact that enterprises are relying more on Wi-Fi. Originally, that forecast said a 41% offloading. They had to up that offloading to 44%. So if enterprises are relying more on Wi-Fi, that's amount of money that they save by not incurring the cost of paying cellular providers for that particular traffic. That particular savings amounts to these $54 billion in producer surplus that should be added to the economy. Moving right along, as I mentioned before, producer surplus has not only the savings for enterprises, but also the margins incurred by equipment sales. And these are a number of equipment that would be triggered by the availability of additional spectrum, those sold both to consumers and enterprises. In addition, and more importantly, and particularly within the 6 gigahertz proposal, this decision will trigger the explosion of AR and VR equipment. And we are seeing that even in the context of the current pandemic. So equipment sales and the use cases are exploding. in our study, I believe we documented around 6 of use cases, but in our research, we identified more than 30 in different areas of the economy. So think about the case of these, let's call it new subsector or new industry, delivering both hardware equipment, software applications, and applications development around these AR and VR solutions. And that's creating an ecosystem. We just factored in here the margins of equipment providers and software developers and applications providers, only the margins of those sales. And we got an impact quite important along the lines of $13 billion, but in total, from the spillover impact, that means the effect on the overall economy in terms of productivity and the like, the value would be 25 billion to the GDP. So AR and VR linked to the 6 GHz proposal is quite critical. Within that same decision, the broader deployment of Internet of Things is critical. As of 2020, there are 138 million devices, and we call them machine to machine and not differentiating them with IoT devices just because there's an easier metric to follow. It's the number of devices actually connected to IoT networks. And the projections indicate that that number is going to reach 213 million in 2025. Now, again, the spillover effect of IoT is dramatic. We estimate, in fact, that 10% increase in M2M connections is going to result in annual increases in GDP of 0.3%. And this is in production functions that were on the most conservative side. We really didn't want to use the coefficients that were more aggressive in terms of their economic impact. So 6 GHz would allow the broader deployment of IoT with a higher economic impact in terms of spillover. The last question is, what's going to happen in terms of CapEx and OpEx savings with regards to the deployment of 5G? And this is an issue that is quite a bit at the forefront of the discussion right now. How much money will industry require to invest for deployment of 5G in the United States? Our estimates, which we calibrate against different estimates from different providers, in addition to research conducted overseas within Ofcom, leads to an estimate that roughly, if we were to deploy 5G in the United States within urban, suburban, and selected rural geographies, would require an investment of $220 billion. In that context, Wi-Fi, carrier-grade Wi-Fi hotspots, because of their price advantage relative to Pico sales, have the ability to reduce part of the investment, particularly in suburban and rural geographies. Those savings are in the order of $13 billion. However, in order to avoid any double counting with the GDP impact that I presented before, we excluded that from our numbers. So in sum, extremely important economic value by these 3 areas: GDP, producer surplus, and consumer surplus. And this is why these 2 decisions are so critical for the future of the US economy.
Thank you. I'm just going to ask a couple of questions, Dr. Katz, one that came in and one of my own. And if you have anything else to add, would love to talk about it. Particularly, the study has a 5-year time horizon, and we've been talking a little bit about it's difficult to make these projections in real time. And so, as you mentioned, and both of us mentioned, the 6 gigahertz order was just published in the Federal Register, and there's an open proceeding at the FCC on 5.9 gigahertz. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about when consumers could expect to see benefits from both of these spectrum bands, given that you know, according to the record before the FCC, there are actually many devices currently in use that, you know, with a software upgrade could immediately use the 5.9 gigahertz band. And then 6 is enormously exciting because of the vast amount of spectrum available and the new use cases, et cetera, and its impact on return to speed. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that impacted that first part of your analysis, which is the hardest thing I think you have talked about to get to.
Yeah. Well, the impact of 6 is a no-brainer, and the impact is going to occur quite rapidly, because in fact, our assessment is that, going back to that development of the ecosystem, the applications are, just to use an expression, chomping at the bit to have the ability to start deploying and being adopted by particularly consumers. And I'm focusing quite a bit on these very low power devices that enable all these AR, VR applications. So in that sense, I would expect that 6 is lagging to the development of innovation within the ecosystem of AR and VR, and therefore we would see the implications right away. On the 5.9, it is an interesting question, because if you were to ask me that question in the month of December, I would have said it's going to take some time until we start, like 50% of American households start experiencing these kind of bottleneck. That doesn't mean that there's not a portion of those households that experience it today. But what has happened in the context of COVID is that we've experienced a jump in the usage of broadband, as we all know. In fact, surveys indicate right now that the increase in cloud computing has triggered an augmentation of the Wi-Fi traffic at the PC level of 80%, without even counting video conferencing. So you have that on one regard. On the other hand, what you have is that those 7 devices by household that we were talking about, on average, before December, were somewhat split over a period of time. Now, because of the lockdown, what we have is essentially the children in the average household trying to do distance learning, the parents trying to do telecommuting. So what we have, telecommuting on the basis of that kind of usage that I was talking about before, cloud computing and video conferencing. So the bottleneck becomes even more important. Therefore, the constraints on the usage of consumers have widely extended beyond those high speed users because of the lockdown. Therefore, the impact of 5.9 is going to be quite immediate, given that consumers are realizing, well, Wi-Fi is critical. If I don't have enough good service on Wi-Fi, the digital resilience of the household in the face of a lockdown is hampered. And therefore, I need these kind of decisions to help me actually achieve faster speeds and have this simultaneous usage being enabled. That's to say that the short answer is that the 2 decisions were going to have an immediate critical impact, particularly in light of the current situation.
I really like the term digital resilience, and I confess that I've not heard that before, but it seems like a good way to describe the sum total of things that households are facing when it comes to actually being able to work and learn and participate in the economy. The digital resilience concept is impactful for me. I wanted to move a little bit. You were, the vast majority of the FCC's 6 gigahertz proposal was put into order, but there are a few open questions about very low power devices, and your analysis talks about, and you just mentioned the ecosystem around low power indoor and very low power devices, some of the really interesting and innovative things the FCC has been considering in terms of device classes. I wondered if you could elaborate. You did in your presentation, you talked about them, but you've been able to have conversations with companies and with thinkers on these subjects that I think most of us haven't. So I wonder if you could tell us what you're seeing, and again, what you imagine you'll see in the future from these companies.
Yes. Again, this is interesting because it's almost when we do research in the future, we will have to do research before December and after December because things have changed. And going back to these 6 gigahertz and increased usage of applications and use cases, when we conducted our research, we were finding that there were a wide range of applications that would enable workers to actually continue conducting their work while not necessarily tethered to the physical place or the physical workplace. And as you might probably know, the demand for some of these AR devices, VR devices, has skyrocketed after December. And I'm going to extend the concept of resilience not only to the household, but also to the enterprises. We just published some research looking at the percent of workers that either have to go to work because they are essential, talking about the nurses, the policemen, all the essential occupations, the first responders, and then the people that can do telecommuting like us, the information workers. If you add the two as percent of the total workforce, essentially what you get is roughly between 40 and 50% of the workforce that could actually keep on working. The rest, the 50% of the workforce, which is the underlying number to a large degree on the unemployment figures, is people that cannot either telecommute or don't have to go to work. In that context, technology is a critical component, particularly AR and VR, because in fact, what some applications do is the ability to enhance the percent of workers that cannot do telecommuting, but could actually continue performing productive activity. And this is what explains this jump in the acquisition of devices, because corporations are really seeing that these kind of needs are critical, and to some degree is going to have impact, could have an impact on the level of unemployment if these applications are adopted fairly fast. Now, going back to the ecosystem, all our numbers were calculated on the basis of the impact on the US economy. However, as we all know, if the United States were to take a lead in the deployment and adoption of all these applications, that would create an opportunity for exporting product, expertise, services along the lines of these kind of applications, which are going to become critical around the world. So there's a derivative effect which we have not calculated, which is along the lines of what are the benefits that the United States economy is going to receive by taking a lead in the deployment of these AR and VR applications in terms of the exports that could be generated overseas.
That's really interesting. I think, well, what I think is we have more to come, and certainly we'll look forward to your analyses and those of others as we're really starting to understand more about these networks and how they are inextricably linked with our economy. So with that, I will say thank you to Dr. Katz, and thank you for all of us, for all of you who joined us. We are, as I mentioned, accepting all ideas for future events. We have one coming up with the Wireless Internet Service Providers Association with WISPA We've been talking about digital divide issues and accessibility, and we'll be talking about healthcare, schools, libraries, etc. So we encourage you to join us, but also if there's a topic you want to see discussed, you have our email, and our website is wififorward.org. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Dr. Katz.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.